It's good to see you again. Welcome. I'm Felicity Ezewike. Is 2024 the year democracy was tested in Africa, or is the continent's democracy finally coming of age? This subject was on Christmas Eve scrutinized by Tendai Murisa, writing for the Mail and Guardian. Tendai is of the view that by the end of 2023, it seemed as if the electoral democracy had come to its premature collapse in Africa. Now, according to him, beyond the coups, several studies were beginning to point towards a waning influence of democracy, especially among the youths. These folks, the youths I mean, under the age of 25, make up 60% of the population, making them the biggest voting bloc. Sadly, an Open Society Foundation study suggests that they are less likely to vote, participate in community meetings, or contact political leaders compared to those older than 35. It is against this backdrop that Tendai submits that the elections of 2024 gave democracy another chance. Peaceful elections that led to change occurred in Botswana, Ghana, Senegal, and South Africa, where the ruling ANC lost its majority for the first time. The elections in Namibia led to the ascension of a female president. There is, he believes, a desire among African regional bodies such as the AU and sub-regional bodies such as the ECOWAS, SADC, and EAC to ensure that multi-party democracy thrives. They have, as a result, invested significantly in developing best practice guidelines on the holding of free and fair elections. Election monitoring and observing has grown as a practice across the continent as a result of their efforts. But did this year give us the leap that we need? Is Africa's democracy coming of age, as some are saying, or was it merely tested with little or no wins to speak of? Now, to help us review the year democracy in Africa, I'm joined by Dr. Chika Charles-Aniekwe, international development expert. It's a pleasure to welcome you to One Slot. From your perspective, well, we saw a lot of countries holding elections, and while some of them were peaceful, some of them were contentious and all of that. But what would be some of the notable democratic milestones in 2024? Doc, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. Your system was mute. Now you're unmuted.
Can you hear me very well?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
No, and thanks for having me. And I think your intro quite established some of those notable milestones that we've seen in Africa in 2024. And depends on how you look at it. Many people will argue democracy is tottering in Africa, while many like me will argue that African democracy is coming of age and that we are having a broad-based participation of different groups of people in the democratic discourse and dialogue on the continent. And you did mention that while there seems to be low interest in terms of voting from the youth population, the conversation is a little bit different. If you look at how youths are engaged on the democratic discourse in Africa, you will see that it's sparked interest amongst young people on the continent of Africa. And the new media has the balance in terms of the monopoly of democratic discussion and dialogue. And this is one thing that I can think to say that soon we have to record level of engagement. Now, on the democratic and electoral front, there's also been some notable milestones on the continent. You mentioned Senegal election. Everybody saw how young people galvanized to send a clear message to the former ruling party that they needed change. You saw what happened in Botswana. For the second time, really, an opposition swept the pool. We saw what happened in Ghana, where there was a clear message from populations of Ghana. There's a presidential election, there was a clear majority, but also in the parliamentary election, there was also a clear two-thirds majority. I think one thing that politicians and African has to take into account is that African democracy is changing. People are continuing to demand accountability. There's a lot of discourse. And I think that's a milestone. There's also something I think that we should also be mindful of when we talk about, taking our positives in Africa. I think African democracy is not that old. We started this, what we call the New Africa, around 1960s. Some of the democratic countries we are comparing ourselves to have practiced this for over 200 years or more. So African democracy is between 60 to 60-something years, depending on which region you are in. And I think it's going to take us a long time to be able to mature our democracy to the extent we can compare it to like the Western Europe, but also to countries like in the North America, like Canada and the United States.
Sure,
So
but that's generating another aspect to the conversation, the maturity of democracy in Africa, but the perception of citizens. There is a conversation, a wider conversation as to what democracy truly is what we have adopted, what we should continue to have. And there was a study by Afrobarometer that says 2/3 of Africans still prefer democracy to other systems, but there is a growing, this is not me speaking now, there's a growing sense of dissatisfaction with how democracy is working in practice. So talk to us about the kind of conversation that's being had on what our conception of democracy is. Should it evolve? Should it remain the same? What kind of framework is working for Africa?
I think you're right in terms of the study by Afrobarometer, in terms of the level of despondent on democracy has fared on the continent. And Afrobarometer is not alone in that kind of study. There's also a study by UNDP Africa, Soldiers and Citizens, pointing to the same direction. Is saying that the ephemeral support to military coup d'etat is because of the fact that democracy has not delivered what I could call democracy dividend on the continent. People want to see accountability. People want to see a link between democracy and development. And that seems to be not the case in most of the African countries at the moment. But when it comes to your question around of democracy and the framework of democracy, I think democracy as a principle, as a concept, is what many people have accepted, but the form and nature lies. It has to vary from one country to the other. And I dare say, not even within Africa can you claim to say that it's going to work in the same way in Nigeria, work in the same way, let's say, in the southern part of Africa or in the eastern part of Africa. But there are nuances, there are political cultures, there are levels of socialization that inform how people engage. And if you look at the and let's take Nigeria as an example, it's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country that before colonialism has different nations and different states that existed on themselves. So Nigeria looking at how it forges its own democratic principles or its democratic path becomes something that Nigeria have to look at. So we are not going to be able to paint one picture and say that this to work across the continent. I don't think that's the way to go. And I think it needs to be contextualized. And that's why people are struggling in terms of how democracy is being practiced, in terms of what it says on the broad principles, tenets of democracy, and the practicalities of democracy as you see it in many countries. I think the key thing for me is how do we contextualize it? How do we see what works in Nigeria and ensure that we make sure that we practice democracy in a way that fits into the Nigerian context?
In its most basic form, as we were talking, I was remembering, chanting democracy, government for the people, by the people, and for the people. That is a very simple definition that should work ordinarily. But what we have as democracy, as you've talked about, seems to be evolving. How much of this conversation or this evolving view of democracy is causing young people to support coups? Because we've seen some growing support among the young people who should ideally be rejecting anything that is authoritarian.
Felicity, I don't think what we are seeing is support for coup d'etat. I think that would be a very linear way of looking at what is happening on the continent.
But how else do you define it when young people are cheering on the coup plotters who are now in power and saying, yes, do away with corrupt leaders?
I think, yes, young people are cheering and saying do away with corrupt leaders does not necessarily mean they are supporting coup d'etat. It could also mean they are not satisfied with what they are getting from democracy. Let me point you to the study by UNDP.
No, I'm sorry to interject again. Please don't forget what you're saying. When you say they are dissatisfied, of course we know that they are dissatisfied, but is a shift towards supporting coup d'etat not plain in itself? Young people who are intelligent, smart, and they know what is at stake are applauding these coup plotters.
Applauding the coup plotters, we cannot look at it, Felicity, from black and white. There are gray areas. We have to be able to look beyond black and white. Applauding that coup plotters has come in to dislodge a democratically elected government does not mean a direct support to coup d'etat. It could also mean a dissatisfaction to the level of dividend they are getting from that particular dispensation. It also means that there is no accountability that they are getting from that particular dispensation. It also means a way of showing they are not happy with what they are getting. It doesn't necessarily mean they are supporting coup d'etat. It means that at that particular point in time, what has come to save or what has come to help them to as an outlet for that dissatisfaction is coup d'etat. It doesn't necessarily mean, and there are researches to this, and I would point you to UNDP study on soldiers and citizens. And that's what he's exactly saying, that what we are seeing is an ephemeral support. And you pointed out to Afrobarometer study that your people still favor democracy. And the study by UNDP is saying that the ephemeral support we seems to be seeing is because of the low development we are seeing over years of democracy. And if you look deeper in that research, it's also showing that people are dissatisfied, that are not seeing accountability, that it seems to be some level of impunity in most African countries when it comes to political
So, Doctor, I don't want to keep interjecting, but I really want our viewers to get a broader picture here, because when we talk about dissatisfaction, we're dissatisfied with the kind of leadership we have. We're dissatisfied with the repeated failed promises. But will a seeming, let me rephrase that now, a seeming support for people who use authority, violence to take over power, is that a better option? I ask this question because I and many others were concerned about the fact that this young population represents what this continent will be in future. If we're trying to define what democracy is, then it is imperative that we are clear why these young people are saying what they're saying and what actions they should be taking as against, supporting or seeming to support authoritarian rule.
I go back to what I was trying to say, Felicity. I strongly do not, and there are researches to support this, do not think that the level of protest you see, for example, in Kenya recently, young people protested against the government that led to the sacking of some ministers by the president. We've seen a lot of protests in many African countries. In Ghana, for instance, that you mentioned, there's been over 2 to 3 years of consistent protest by young people in Ghana. Now, let's place two things side by side, Felicity, here. In Ghana, the over 2 years of protest against the government resulted in overwhelming victory by the opposition. Ghana chose a different path. Does not necessarily mean that everybody in Ghana is supporting the opposition. It means that the opposition was a viable option for them to see the government of the day out of power. Now, let's go to Niger or Burkina Faso, any other country, that where there was no election, but military came in. Military came in and the people chanting in support of military means that the government, they were very dissatisfied with government, and at that particular point in time, you made mention about the level of access to information that young people do have these days. Not necessarily mean that they are supporting military rule or coup d'etat. It means that what has been oppressing them at that particular point in time has been taken away from them. If you call for an election in many of these countries and you have a democratically elected government that brings development, that are accountable, the young people will support it. So I think we should not confuse people's level of dissatisfaction to support to undemocratic changes of government or to coup d'etat. I think this is that distinct. We have to make that distinction there, and I think it has to be clear to your viewers that support to unconstitutional changes of government is not what we are seeing in Africa, especially in the Sahel, where I worked for over 5 years. That's not what we are seeing. Look at Senegal, you mentioned. Young people decided, despite, if you followed what happened in Senegal, you see there was a lot of, for lack of a better word, stones thrown on the way of democratic processes. And the young people stood by what they wanted to achieve and voted overwhelmingly.
Okay, maybe I should take this from another aspect. I have another question, but then you're talking, I remember another one, so I'm going to ask you this. It's a repeat of something I asked earlier. You haven't quite spoken it. What kind of conversation should young people be having, even in the face of coup d'etats? Because, again, like I said, they are drivers of the future. And the internet, social media, don't forget, research like we referenced, they're there. People might go and cook up something that might not be strictly correct. But there are emerging conversations that are bothersome. So I guess that's where I'm going. What kind of conversation should the young people be pushing with their dissatisfaction with what is currently obtained in the continent?
No, I think that's much more clear. I think the kind of conversation we should be having is the conversation on how young people should be much more involved, not as spectators, not as reactors to what is happening, but as key participants in the process. I think one of the many good things I've seen in Nigeria, especially from the civil society angle, is the work done by Yaiga Africa, or Not Too Young to Run, that has allowed young people that, reduce the number of age for young people to get into politics. I think that we have to move into that level of conversation for young people to begin to contest, for young people to begin to run from the local level to the state level to the federal level. It is not enough for young people to be on the internet, on the social media, to criticize government, to let out their frustration. I think if you look at the history of most African countries, some of the people that drove and achieved independence were at the age of late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s, going to 40s. And we have to begin to move into that direction, that young people need to become key participants in the democratic process. They need to contest. And they also need to mobilize other young people to be part of the process. You made mention, Felicity, in your introduction, that despite the conversation, despite the fact that we have access to new media, social media, and despite the level of conversation you are seeing online, when the chips are down to vote, we see that young people are the least in terms of voting. We need to translate that conversation into vote. We need to translate that conversation into participation in politics. We need to translate that anger of protest into registration and becoming part of the process. So I think that is what young people are missing in most African countries. It is not enough to criticize government I think it is much more important that they follow the process and know what they should do to be elected to run the government. That's what I would say
Well,
should be the next focus of young people
I
across
mean,
Africa.
your submission is not very different from what some other scholars that I've spoken with have said, but there are bottlenecks. These things don't come easily. There are people who are seated in power, in democracy across Africa, who manipulate the system, and that's part of the grievances. How will young people make inroads in participating fully, like you were suggesting, in our democratic process? Because we talk about it, but there doesn't seem to be a real way. Even the young ones that are now coming up to join politics seem like they are already compromised.
I think there are many ways they can have inroads, Felicity. One, we are seeing across Africa, I mentioned Kenya, young people seems to take their frustration to the street, which is their right to do so. There are a lot of civil society organizations that work with young people across the continent to provide them the opportunity to participate in political processes. I think they need to understand that. Secondly, there are bottlenecks, as you mentioned. For example, in most countries on the continent, the registration fee to contest is so outrageous that when people look at it, they're better off not contesting at all. I think they have to advocate and build alliances to be able to reduce such those kind of exorbitant fees that hinder them from participating. And such alliances means working with people that ordinarily you do not want to work with, including politicians. Young people have to find a way to work with politicians, especially in this instance, the lawmakers that has the power to change policies and law that hinder young people from participating, such as, for example, fees for entrance and all of that. Two, young people also can look at starting from the local level. Let me bring this home to Nigeria. Oftentimes, we pay a lot of attention at the federal level and at the state level, and we forget that governance is local. Local government is at the core of development in many African countries and beyond Africa. Young people have to find a way of learning how to govern at the local level.
Oh, I have to interject. I just looked at the time. We're fast running out, and I've barely touched the questions I have. So I'll just go ahead and ask. You talked about Nigeria and the young people. Frankly speaking, a lot of the concern is, I mean, you've heard of the defections, the movement
Yes.
from parties. Young people who got the opportunity looks to be kissing to stay relevant in politics, unfortunately. But let's move the needle a bit so I don't lose steam and talk about coup d'etats still. Between 2020 and 2023, we had cases repeatedly, and that's why it played quite a role in the conversation about democratic trends in Africa this year. What I just want you to do is paint us a picture of the implication, the long-term implication, if nothing is done. While you are speaking on that, I'd also like you to take on the response of regional bodies like AU to some of these coups that has occurred. They are even having interactions with these countries after initially sanctioning them. It seems it's now business as usual. I'm sorry, that's quite a mouthful.
Now, in terms of the coup d'etat we've seen across the continent, for majority of which has happened in the Sahel, I think there are long-term implications depending on how you look at it. Let's look at it from its implication on the politics and democracy on the continent. I think it's a message to the political elites, to democracy across the continent, that we have to get it right, and that if we don't get it right, we might go back to the 1970-80 era, where we have a lot of coup d'etats on the continent. We don't want to go there. Like you said, we want democracy. We want to refine democracy. That's one implication. The second implication is that you mentioned about the seeming, quote unquote, support to coup d'etat, that political elites will begin to understand that it's not going to be business as usual. While we feel very saddened, Felicity, in terms of what is happening, we should also be applaud ourselves as a continent that our message being sent across different countries. You mentioned Botswana, you mentioned Namibia, you mentioned Senegal, you mentioned Ghana. These are examples that is not going to be business as usual. This is one of the implications. When the president-elect of Ghana gave his speech, he said he recognizes that this was not a vote for him, but a gate against lack of accountability, and he knows what the task is ahead. So that's the message. Political elites should understand that it's not going to be business as usual, and that it could go left or it could go right, and that's the need for inclusivity. Now, let's look at the second part of your question in terms of the responses of regional organizations. I think first and foremost, Felicity, we have to understand the configuration of regional organizations to understand their mandate and how they function. Institutions like the African Union, ECOWAS, SADC are intergovernmental. So the power derives from the member states. They do not have overarching power against member states. And also, they have to stand by their principles. If you look at the ECOWAS good governance framework, it's very, very clear in terms of what will happen if you go through coup d'etat. But it also gives opportunity for ECOWAS to support member states to come back to the democratic processes and principles. The same applies to the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. That is very, very clear in terms of what should happen if a country goes through coup d'etat. So what these institutions are doing, they are mainly following the framework on how they should ensure, because if you give a blank slate that any country that go through coup d'etat, there are no consequences, then you are writing a blank check to many countries to do that.
True,
but
true.
also you do not necessarily have to abandon all the country to take a very, very bad route. And you mentioned the world is much more interconnected, and much more, especially look at West Africa. Much more interconnected.
I'm really sorry to interject, Doctor. We are out of time for this conversation. It's never enough time when you're having conversations like this because of the multifaceted nature. So I'll thank you now. Thank you so much for giving us your time and providing further insight. I hope to speak to you about our definition of democracy someday, maybe one full hour. We can talk about that and get our viewers to learn something new. Thank you again.
Thank you, Felicity. Thank you for having me, and they're looking forward for an opportunity to speak to you again on a number of other issues as well.